In a tense and revealing encounter aboard a flight, a smug businessman with a sense of superiority finds himself face to face with an older man who, at first glance, seems out of place in first class. As the businessman taunts him, mocking his presence and making condescending remarks, he has no idea that the man he is belittling is none other than Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor. When the businessman realizes his mistake, he's forced to confront his own arrogance and learn a valuable lesson about respect, humility, and true strength. Did you enjoy this story of humility and personal growth? Don't miss out on more inspiring tales like this one. Hit the subscribe button now to stay updated on our latest stories and never miss an opportunity to reflect on life's lessons. The early morning hustle at Phoenix Airport was the usual scene. First-class passengers heading to Los Angeles, with the hum of chatter and rolling luggage filling the air. But among them, one man was impossible to overlook. He wasn't just a blur in a well-tailored navy suit and shining leather shoes that practically reflected the harsh terminal lights. It was the aura he carried with him. His every step seemed calculated, deliberate, as though the ground beneath him was there to serve him. His sharp features, confident posture, and purposeful stride spoke volumes about his position in the world. This was a man who had worked his way to the top, and he didn't need to say it for you to know. To him, this flight wasn't merely about getting from one place to another. It was about asserting control, about reminding the world around him of his place. As he made his way toward the gate, his leather briefcase swung rhythmically, almost as if it were an extension of his own presence, commanding attention. His eyes scanned the other passengers, each of them, from the people waiting at the gate to the flight attendants preparing for boarding, seemed beneath him. He carried himself with an unmistakable air of superiority, as if the very privilege of sharing space with him was something the others should feel grateful for. The businessman settled into his first-class seat, feeling a wave of satisfaction as he began scrolling through emails on his tablet. He was already in his element, isolated from the rest of the passengers, comfortably distanced from the chaos of the boarding process. But then, as the aisle began to fill, his eyes were drawn to the older man making his way down the cabin. The contrast between them was immediately striking. The businessman, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit and polished leather shoes, looked every bit the part of a corporate elite. In contrast, the older man was dressed simply, a tan jacket over a faded plaid shirt, paired with worn loafers that seemed far more suited for a leisurely stroll in a park than for a luxury flight. The businessman raised an eyebrow, already forming an opinion, the kind of judgment that came easily to him. After all, someone in that outfit clearly didn't belong in first class. But as the older man made his way down the aisle, there was something undeniably different about him. His presence didn't scream wealth or status, but something else. Something more difficult to define. His face, weathered by years of life, carried an aura of quiet confidence, as though he had long ago stopped worrying about appearances or judgments. There was a peacefulness in the way he moved, as if he wasn't concerned with what anyone else thought of him. As he approached his seat and settled down, adjusting his seatbelt with a casual ease, the businessman couldn't help but smirk. Who was this old? And what was he even doing in first class? In that moment, the businessman's smugness took root. He couldn't fathom how someone like the older man had earned a spot in the coveted section of the plane. And as the man settled in beside him, a thought crossed his mind. This was the kind of person who had probably never been given a second glance in life. What could he possibly know about the world of privilege I inhabit? The businessman leaned in, his lips curling into a smirk, clearly enjoying himself. He couldn't resist taking another shot, hoping the older man would finally bite, would react to his sarcasm. In a tone that was laced with arrogance, he spoke loud enough for the man to hear. "Looks like first class isn't as exclusive as it used to be." He waited for a reaction, looking for the older man to flinch, to show some sign of discomfort or embarrassment. But to his surprise, the older man didn't budge. The older man's face remained as still as ever, his gaze fixed firmly out of the window. His composure was so unshaken, it only deepened the businessman's irritation. What was this old's deal? Was he not aware of how out of place he seemed? The businessman felt his attempt at humor fall flat, his target unresponsive. His smirk faded slightly, but he wasn't done yet. No, not by a long shot. He tried again, a little more forcefully this time. His voice edged with a sharper tone as he leaned in once more, now hoping to provoke the man. "What's the occasion?" he asked with mock curiosity, raising an eyebrow. "Did they hand out charity upgrades today?" There it was, a little more personal this time, a little more biting. He leaned back, waiting for the older man to either respond or, better yet, react in a way that would validate his superiority. But once again, the older man remained unflinching. His eyes didn't even waver from the window, as if the businessman's words held no weight. His posture remained composed, as though he couldn't care less. The businessman felt his words hang in the air, unanswered, the silence growing thicker with each passing second. It was becoming more and more evident that the older man wasn't going to react the way he wanted. His irritation turned to confusion, followed by an uncomfortable realization. This man, this seemingly unremarkable figure, was not only unbothered by his insults, but was completely impervious to them. It was as though the businessman's attempts to rattle him were meaningless. The older man wasn't playing by the rules the businessman had set, and it unsettled him in a way he couldn't easily explain. Frustrated, but undeterred, the businessman shifted in his seat, still trying to find some way to break the older man's calm facade. But the older man, wise in his years and experiences, remained as calm as ever, showing no sign of concern. This was a battle of wills, but it was quickly becoming clear who was winning. As the plane lifted off and settled into the smooth hum of cruising altitude, the businessman found himself unable to shake off the encounter. The older man's unbothered silence gnawed at him, a challenge he couldn't ignore. Without thinking, he leaned slightly into the aisle, making sure his voice carried just loud enough for the nearby passengers to catch. "So, what's the story here? Did you win the lottery? Or are you just here for a trip down memory lane? Back when planes had propellers instead of engines?" The older man didn't flinch. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, but it was only for a second, long enough to feel the weight of the question hanging in the air. Then, as quickly as it happened, the older man shifted his gaze back out the window. No anger, no response, just an unwavering calm that seemed to speak louder than any words could. The businessman felt a jolt of irritation, but it only made him push further. The silence from the older man was like an invitation to keep prodding, and he couldn't resist the urge to press on. Finally, as the flight attendants made their rounds down the aisle, everything shifted. One of them paused next to the older man, offering him a drink with a polite smile. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, addressing him with a respect that made the businessman's stomach drop. The name struck him like a lightning bolt. Clint Eastwood, the legendary actor, the very person he had been mocking, ridiculing, and dismissing as just some old man, was sitting right next to him. The recognition hit him like a freight train, and for a brief moment, everything around him seemed to blur. His mind raced, unable to process the sudden turn of events. The man he had been so quick to belittle, so eager to judge, was none other than Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood icon, a symbol of strength, wisdom, and resilience. The realization flooded over him, and he could feel the heat rise to his face as whispers started to ripple through the cabin. Other passengers, now aware of the identity of the man he had so carelessly mocked, exchanged glances, their murmurs growing louder as the truth settled in. The businessman's arrogance quickly turned to disbelief, his smugness completely wiped away. The businessman froze, his previous smug expression now completely gone. It was as though a cold wave had washed over him. his body stiffening in realization. His mouth went dry, and his fingers tightened around the armrest as the truth slowly sank in. The name Eastwood echoed in his mind like an alarm bell. Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood legend, the very man he had ridiculed with such disdain. The weight of his mistake hit him like a ton of bricks. He could feel the heat rising in his face, the humiliation creeping up his neck as his arrogance bled out of him. The whispers around him only made it worse. "Is that really him?" someone murmured from a few rows behind. The businessman tried to will himself out of the moment, but there was no escape. The ripple of recognition was spreading through the cabin faster than he could process it, and with each new whisper, the businessman's face grew paler. The passengers around him began to look at him with a mix of judgment and pity, some even stealing glances his way as the revelation took hold. He slunk lower into his seat, sinking into the leather, wishing the floor would swallow him whole. His thoughts raced, but none of them could undo the damage he had done. There was no taking back the condescending jabs, the mockery, no erasing the disdainful tone he had used when referring to a man of such status and stature. The truth was unavoidable now. He had been wrong, completely and utterly wrong. And there was no way to undo it. He had dismissed the wrong person, the very last person he should have crossed. The businessman had underestimated Clint Eastwood, and now that mistake would hang over him for the rest of the flight. It was a lesson in humility he had never expected to learn in a place like this, from a man like that. The businessman, now realizing the weight of his actions, turned slowly toward Clint Eastwood. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his palms were sweating as though the plane's air conditioning had suddenly stopped working. He swallowed hard, trying to find the right words, but nothing felt adequate. He had been so sure of himself before, so convinced of his superiority. Now, in the face of the very man he had mocked, he was nothing more than a fumbling fool. "Excuse me, Mr. Eastwood," he stammered, the words catching in his throat. His voice was shaky, unsure, and so small compared to the confident tone he'd used earlier. There was no arrogance now, only the weight of his regret. The businessman couldn't meet Eastwood's eyes for long. The piercing gaze of the older man felt like a quiet storm, and it was impossible to avoid. Eastwood's expression didn't change. He wasn't angry, but his eyes were steady, unblinking, calm. He seemed to regard the businessman with a kind of silent understanding, as if he'd seen this kind of situation before, 1,000 times. But despite the unspoken grace in Eastwood's demeanor, the businessman could feel the tension in the air, like a thick fog hanging between them. The words of apology struggled to escape him. He tried to speak again, but his throat felt tight, as if his vocal cords had betrayed him. He hadn't prepared for this moment. He never thought it would come. The businessman had imagined a world where he could throw around jabs with no consequences, a world where he was always in control, always at the top. But now, the floor had dropped out from under him, and he found himself completely disarmed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been in years. I'm sorry," he finally managed to say, though the apology felt clumsy and incomplete, almost like it wasn't enough. His mind scrambled to find the right words to express his remorse, but nothing seemed fitting. I didn't know who you were. His voice trailed off, and for a long moment, the two men simply stared at each other. The businessman knew he was asking for forgiveness, but the true meaning behind his apology was harder to find than he'd thought. In that silence, the realization hit him harder than ever. It wasn't just about apologizing for mocking a man of Eastwood's stature. It was about confronting the arrogance that had led him to dismiss someone as insignificant without even considering the person behind the exterior. Eastwood didn't rush to speak. His gaze never wavered, but there was a quiet intensity to it now. He raised an eyebrow, his face still calm, almost unreadable. "If I weren't who you thought I was, would that make the way you spoke to me okay?" His voice was steady, almost too steady. The question hung in the air like a punch that hadn't landed yet, but you could feel its force building. The businessman froze. It was as if the world around him stopped for a second. Time seemed to slow. Eastwood's words cut deeper than anything the businessman had heard before. The arrogance he had felt so certain of, the smugness that had so easily rolled off his tongue, was suddenly laid bare in front of him. He wanted to speak, to defend himself, to make some excuse, but the weight of Eastwood's question rendered him mute. The older man's words weren't about the celebrity identity, but about his behavior, about the mindset that allowed him to dismiss someone based on appearance, based on assumptions. The businessman suddenly saw himself for what he was, a man so wrapped up in his own world that he hadn't even stopped to consider what kind of person he had been treating with such disdain. He hadn't seen Eastwood as a man, but as a target for his jokes, his superiority. Eastwood leaned back in his seat, sipping his coffee slowly. Respect isn't about who someone is. It's about who you are. The businessman froze. Those words hit him like a sudden blow, cutting through his arrogance. He hadn't expected this. No harsh words, no retaliation, just a quiet, simple truth. Real respect, Eastwood continued, isn't earned by titles or reputations. It's about how you treat people, even when they can't do anything for you. The businessman felt a lump in his throat. He had been so blinded by his own sense of superiority, measuring respect by money, status, and power. But Eastwood was showing him that true respect had nothing to do with any of that. It was about decency, kindness, and treating everyone with dignity, whether they could offer you something or not. The businessman suddenly realized just how wrong he had been. He had been chasing respect for all the wrong reasons. Now, for the first time, he understood what it truly meant. As the flight continued, the businessman sat quietly, reflecting on Eastwood's words. He thought about his past, about all the times he judged people by their job titles or appearances, thinking he was better than them. He thought about all the opportunities he'd missed to truly connect with others. The plane was descending, and as he looked out at the Los Angeles skyline, it didn't feel like the usual destination. It felt like a reminder of who he had been when he boarded. The man who judged success by status and wealth, blind to his own flaws. When the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, the businessman knew something had changed inside him. He wasn't the same person who had boarded this flight. He had learned a valuable lesson from Clint Eastwood, not through loud words or anger, but through quiet strength and dignity.